Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Fiifi Boateng, and I'll be your facilitator for this session. And this webinar is going to be based on digital rights and ethical communication. So if you permit me, I would like to share my screen, and then we can kick off. Okay. Okay. If I may, please, do you see my screen?
We do.
All right, perfect. Okay. Okay. Pardon me for the date. I should have changed that. So basically, like I mentioned before, this webinar will be based on discussions are going to be based on digital rights and ethical communication, specifically for nonprofits and how nonprofits can navigate the digital space. Okay, so the objective for this webinar will be to empower its participants with the knowledge and skills to navigate the digital space responsibly and ensuring the ethical communication practices within their nonprofit organizations and also within the development sector as well. And I believe, where the world has gotten to now, we all participate online one way or the other, either by financial means or social means, or even business or working the way we work and interact. One way or the other, that responsibly and also ethically. All right. So before I go ahead, you can check the bottom of your page. You see a chat section along the line of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can type it in there and I will attend to it when the time comes. If you also want to give some comments or share your views or ask any questions, you can also use the icon, the emoji icon, to raise your hands, and I will give you the floor to speak. Okay. And I'll introduce myself again. My name is Fiifi Boateng, and I will be your facilitator for today's session. So we're going to begin with trying to understand the foundations or the basis for digital rights and cyber laws. What are the difference and how are they related, the relationship between the two, and how we can engage using the two as a tool in our nonprofit activities. Okay. So basically, digital rights are rights that are derived from the broader human rights principles. An example of such principles would be freedom of expression, right to privacy, and access to information. Most digital rights follow the international human rights principles, basically. And with that, what this means is that your rights within the digital space is just looking at it from this perspective, the rights you enjoy offline being transferred online, so you don't miss out. So it doesn't. So now you have your rights both in person or in real life and virtually as well. So you're not vulnerable to any form of abuse or attack or threat whilst you engage online. And it is also to give you some form of autonomy and also allow you to be able to participate online activities properly and also navigate a digital environment with ease and with undue restrictions and infringements. Okay. So in simple terms, data rights encompass the fundamental liberties and protection that individuals possess in the digital space. And like I mentioned before, it stems from the fundamental human rights that has been accepted globally that you enjoy in person or in real life. So it's just the same thing or some components of it that you need to enjoy or that you benefit from whilst you're online. A typical example of this kind of data rights will be the prominent one that most data rights laws or policies have been taking inspiration from, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. And then this regulation is mostly used within the EU. And what this stipulates is that it gives individuals control over their data. Basically, in essence, they have the right to determine how their data is being processed or used by organizations. For example, Facebook, Twitter, or X, if I may say, Instagram, TikTok. It empowers individuals. And in Europe, most organizations are aware of this regulation, or most organizations that operate mainly online are aware of this kind of regulation. So people have the right to be able to tell organizations to, first of all, either delete their data or determine how their data will be used. So they give them that mandate, and so that is an example of a data right policy or regulation. Okay, and we'll move on to cyber security. But before we move on to that, you might ask yourself, what does cyber mean? Basically, the idea or the concept of cyber is a culture of computers, or the interconnectivity of computers or information technology or virtual reality, basically. So when they say cyber, it pertains to everything that is connected per computer. So that means that computers that operate offline, for example, like mobile phones that don't have internet connection, that use what they call the SSD, or text messages, stuff like this, they also fall under the cyber landscape. So it falls under that. So it's not exclusive to only Internet of Things or just the internet, but things that are connected by computer, one or the other. Okay. So cyber laws. So cyber laws are more like established rules or standards or procedures that regulate behavior online. It is also supposed to help resolve disputes and also enforce compliance in the digital environment, basically. But you come to realize sometimes cyber laws are more backed by legal documentations or by law. So it might differ from country to country, whereas digital rights are more global or universal. So the idea of cyber laws is to serve to protect individuals and organizations and the society at large from cyber threats, and also to ensure that there's an order in the way the digital ecosystem functions. And for people joining from America or Europe, I'll be stating some examples of such laws and policies. Sorry, I think I see the chat. Okay. Oh, nice. Okay, welcome, Debbie. I can see you're tuning in from New York. Welcome. I'm glad you are, you are in America, so I might probably put you on the spot here to ask a few questions or to let you share more light on some of the laws that are being implemented in the US and how, people access them and how they are being used. So welcome. Okay, so back to the cyber laws. So they basically are a set of rules or regulations that sort of protect how people engage online, and also helps protect your digital rights as well. So not just that, but also protect your digital rights. And an example of such cyber law will be the common one, I think in America, is called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And it's basically a cyber law that addresses various forms of cyber threats and cyber crime. And basically, it also includes unauthorized access to people's data, or what you call hacking. When people hack your system and they take your information without your permission or illegally. Yes. So these laws are in place, or such a law is in place to protect people from such cyber threats, and it's called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or what they call the CFAA. And I know people have been prosecuted uh, prosecuted in America based on this law. I think a few years ago there was a case with an online scam that went viral during the COVID period, where people were stealing, I think, social security numbers in America to receive COVID funding in Dubai. And I think the CIA worked with people in Dubai to arrest these people, and they were being, tried based on this cyber law as well. The CA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So it's something that is in play and is being used to protect citizens in America. In my country, I don't know what they use here currently, because we are struggling. I'm from Ghana, by the way. We are struggling with implementation issues, and even equipping the regulatory bodies that are supposed to implement this. But in America, I know it's in full swing and it's being used. All right. So in a nutshell, in essence, the cyber laws, like I mentioned, are legal frameworks and regulations that govern activities in the cyberspace. These laws encompass a wide range of issues, including cybersecurity, data protection, intellectual property rights, online commerce, and cyber crime. So yes, this is basically the relationship between digital rights and cyber laws. I'm going to go more in depth as we move ahead. So our next session, we're going to look at, sorry, just 1 minute. We will look at some frameworks that are being used to develop these both cyber laws and digital rights. So like I mentioned earlier, for digital rights, one of the frameworks they use, or it stems from the international human rights instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in this regard, basically what it means is that most digital rights laws or policies are based on this. So wherever you go in the world, it still stands. It is recognized and accepted as a right. So, and within these rights, with regards to digital rights, it takes count into rights to privacy, I mentioned earlier, freedom of expression, and also freedom of association as well. So basically, you have the right to privacy whilst you're online as well. And also you have the right to be able to express yourself freely without any restrictions. Also, but in certain countries, these things are not possible. So some citizens will demonstrate that their rights are being infringed upon, and they are right. So as long as it's universally recognized, yes, it is something that they can argue about. Excuse me. So the next framework that we'll look at is the regional data protection regulations. And a typical example will be what I mentioned with the European Union, where they have the general data protection regulation. So you realize that most cyber laws or data rights are based on a regional regulation that people come together. For example, in Africa, we have a regional data right protection law by the AU, the African Union also. And then the ECOWAS also has its own, which is for West Africa as well, similar to what they have in the Europe, where it empowers. And they all draw inspiration from the GDPR as well. with a few tweaks based on the context and the digital landscape within the region as well. And one thing along the line, we realize that it's quite difficult to also have an updated one because of how fast the digital landscape keeps evolving. But we'll come to that in details. So yes, one of the frameworks that cyber laws and data rights are built on is the regional data protection regulations, and it differs from country to country, but they are not too different. They are quite similar. They have a few common lines that they all follow. And then we have the cyber standard and best practices laws. So when you go into details with certain cyber laws and digital rights in various countries, you realize some of them adopt some international regulations like the ISO 2701 or the cybersecurity framework by the NIS. I'm going to share a document that explains all these things into details. And with that, with the cyber security standards and best practices, what this is that these guidelines provide steps on how to manage cybersecurity risk, basically. So some cyber laws outline these steps, others give guidelines on how you can go about it as an individual, as an organization, and as a citizen, basically. Another framework that these rights and laws are built on is what they call the open internet principle. And what the open internet principle means is that online services and content should be accessible to everyone without discrimination or without interference by internet providers. So in countries where some content is censored, so you can't have access to certain information or content, most cybersecurity laws incorporate what they call the net neutrality or the internet neutrality that stipulates that everybody should have access to every information online without restrictions. In certain countries, when there's an citizens uprising online, the government censors certain kind of information. So and they do that through the internet providers. So if you look for a certain type of information about the government or a hashtag, you might not find it. It's because it's been censored, and that is against, your right to access to information. So most digital rights laws or cybersecurity laws incorporate this principle as well. They draw from these principles. So like I keep saying, most cybersecurity laws are built around these frameworks or these pillars. And I think after this session, I would be happy if we could all take time to, research more on our individual countries and the cyber laws that exist and what it entails, or what are the details of these cyber laws and data rights policies that they have in place. The next one, or the next framework, is the multi-stakeholder initiative. For an example of that would be the Global Network Initiative. And basically what they do is they bring together companies, civil society organizations, and investors, and also sometimes investors or academics, to promote freedom of expression and online privacy. So you realize up to this point, there are some commonalities between these frameworks. They all sort of all speak about the same thing, but in different angles and contexts and perspectives. So yes, most cyber laws and data rights per the continent you are on, they all use frameworks that fall along these lines as well. And then you have the last framework, which is, there are more, but these are the key ones that stand out most, is the Digital Ethics Guideline, which stems from the Global Initiative for Ethical Consideration. And I think this is not too old, it's quite recent, because of, the emergence of AI now, and also the fact that AI has become a common place, now it's accessible to every single person or the ordinary person. So these ethics or guidelines are there to also protect people with innovation and how they use AI ethically, basically. So most cyber laws or ethical rights, data rights, will have elements of these ethical considerations or these data guidelines as well. I'm going to pause here. If anyone has a question or a comment, please, you can use the icon to raise your hand, or you can put in the chat section a question or comment, and then I will address it. If not, I'm going to proceed. So basically, overall, these are all cross-cutting frameworks for data rights and cyber laws, and basically to help shape the legal environment of the cyber landscape as we know it. And I think it's imperative for nonprofits on how they operate and how they can use these laws and these frameworks to influence policies also, and also to comply, to be compliant, and which could also go a long way to add to their credibility and their legitimacy as well. And it's very resourceful, or it's to be very helpful if we could take time to understand and engage with these frameworks so we can better equip ourselves and our constituents, or the people we serve as NGOs or as nonprofits, to be able to also navigate online platform safely. I see a question or a comment in the group. Okay, so this is a question from Debbie. She says, with AI changing the digital climate, how can nonprofits utilize it from an ethical perspective? Okay, perfect. So for nonprofits, I believe that with AI now, which is being used heavily in content production for most nonprofits, or most nonprofits are coming to terms with it. It is an ethical way a nonprofit can use this is always have or declare when they use AI to generate any form of content. For example, whether it be a proposal or an article or a blog or research, they need to be able to declare that portions of this article was generated with the help of artificial intelligence. That is one ethical way of using it. And also not using AI to, steal what they call intellectual property. For example, if you use AI and it takes some information from some knowledge bank, you need to be able to reference it and also state that this was done with AI and most references are from here, so and so. You can also use AI to even cross-check or review documents as well. And that's one ethical way of doing that. And you can also use AI to teach your constituents on how to protect themselves from cyber threats as well. That is one ethical way you can adopt and use AI. But in general, for most nonprofits or for civil society, it is key that when we use AI for any form of activity or production, we state it clearly and it is labeled so people are aware and people know, and we don't use AI to influence people's behavior badly, for example, to generate fake news or misinformation as well. So let's be wary of that. I hope that answers your question, Debbie. Okay. Proceed to our next session. So basically, because this webinar was shared to a larger audience, and we are aware that people are going to be joining from all parts of the world, most of the analysis we're going to do is going to take its information from the global perspective. So we're going to touch on certain laws and cyber laws and digital rights policies from Europe, America, Africa, Asia as well, in terms of continents that way, so that we are all sort of gets a global perspective on digital rights and cyber laws. So the first on this analysis will be, we're going to look at the European region. Okay, there's a question. Thank you. Okay, I'm glad that answers your question. Okay, so our first analysis will look at the digital landscape and digital laws and cyber laws in Europe and see how, they apply them and how it's being used over there. Okay, so basically, like I said, I think in the beginning of my presentation, I stated the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and I mentioned that because it was not entirely the very, very first, but the first major regulation on the data landscape. Most data rights laws or cyber laws drew inspiration from there. And Europe boasts of some of the most comprehensive data rights and cybersecurity laws globally. And notably, like I said, is the GDPR that I mentioned earlier on. And this regulation or this policy is basically sets strict guidelines for data protection and also privacy. It's what basically it does is that it is being there's a regulatory body which mandates cybersecurity for critical infrastructures in Europe. So for internet providers operating in Europe, they need to follow these laws or these regulations. And what this goes is that these regulations are supposed to enhance user privacy and cybersecurity resilience across the whole of Europe. So it affects all the European states. And I think when Britain or the UK during the Brexit, they are now out of the EU. So they might have to develop their own data right or data protection regulation. But wherever you go in Europe, apart from the UK, this regulation still holds and it still stands. And most the data right issues or cyber crime issues are being dealt with based on this regulation. So there was a scenario where in Europe, a couple that did some photo shoot with a particular car brand, I think it was Volvo, posted on their social media, and Volvo took the same pictures and used it as an ad. And they took Volvo to court, they sued them, and the case was being dealt with based on this particular regulation with the data, because whatever content they generated was their data, was their personal data, and was on their personal page. And Volvo took it. There were some arguments in there that, certain platforms have certain rules or terms and conditions, and that once you have a profile that is public, that means everything on there is for the public use. So sometimes there's a thin line between all these things, and there are also contradictions between the platform regulations and terms and conditions and the data rights or the cyber laws in the countries they operate in. So in Europe, this is what you have, and this is what most European states are, moving or being operating on generally. Yes. I don't know if you have anybody joining from Europe. You could also share some view or comment based on this. If you've had any experience, applying these laws in Europe, you can share some insight. If not, we'll move on to the next session or the next part of this analysis. With this side, like I said, I'm already spoken about the EU and how they use the Act. Yes, and then the United Kingdom, like I said, after the Brexit, they basically have to look at ways they can have, some data protection laws. They have an act which aligns with the GDPR, but it is not as comprehensive as the GDPR as well. So they might have to revise that. And also, in Europe, the data landscape is evolving at a faster rate. So sometimes most of these laws have to be sort of revised constantly with all these virtual reality and then, what they call the dark web and the deep web going on. cryptocurrency, all these things. Constantly, law enforcement are supposed to develop policies and regulations to be able to address issues surrounding these cases. Okay, so with the GDPR, the areas of concerns will be ensuring consistent enforcement across the whole of Europe and its member states. And like I said, most of these laws, so you have a digital rights law, which is regional, and then you might go into certain countries that have cyber laws that only pertain to their country, and it might not necessarily align entirely with the regional regulation. So some of these are challenges that most countries face or most regions face. As we go along, you realize that it's a common thing. And then the potential divergence from like I mentioned, the Brexit. Now the EU protection laws need to be refined and redefined and restructured and designed again, because now that they're out of the EU, they need to look at what works for them as well and how they can align it to that. Yes. So I really wish we could have, after here, people would take time to, go through these laws and assess them and see. So with challenges like this, sometimes the recommendation will be for civil society or non-profits to advocate for, a consistent GDPR or a consistent cyber law or data right policy across all countries. That way it's easier to implement, So when you're implementing these laws, you don't face challenges or you don't have hurdles or obstacles that are being created by cyber laws in each country, So these advocacy efforts need to go towards these lines as we may see and as we move along. Okay. So our next analysis, we're going to look at the North America. And given the fact that America, it's a huge country with several states that have, their own individual laws, there are some challenges as well, quite similar to what they have in Europe. Also, we'll look at that and then we'll see where America stands in the fight against cybercrime and cyber threats, and also protecting of data rights. Okay, so like I said, we are going to look at it as in terms of the continent. So I might not be able to go in detail for each country because each country has its own laws and policies. But I'm going to look at it. I'm going to pick the major ones or the key laws from the countries, and then we'll address them. So the United States has, what they call a patchwork of data rights and cybersecurity laws, both at the federal level and at the state level. And like I mentioned, these things, they are not consistent. Also because of the context of the country as well. So you can't really have that. And I think eventually they will come to a point where this will come about. And one of these laws, the cyber laws I mentioned earlier, was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Hi, Fifi. We actually lost you for a bit.
Oh, okay. Please, where did you lose me? Because I didn't even realize.
Literally, as you were going to go on the next part, we lost you. I think it's I guess your signal, like the situation in Ghana.
Yes, we're having internet challenges. Sorry, I forgot to announce that. So, yes, I might drop on and off because we have a internet challenge and it's quite regional or it's within the West African region. We have a common internet provider and it's facing a huge challenge currently. So that we have trouble with our internet. It is not the best, it's not consistent. So if I drop off, please forgive me. It's beyond my control. And I hope that it will be stable enough for us to get, the best out of it. And
Oh
it
no.
will also drag the training. Yes.
You,
So,
you can continue. You are the host now.
okay. Thank you very much. So, I don't know if I dropped off with the European analysis or the
You were getting into the United States.
okay, perfect. Perfect. So please permit me to share my screen for a minute. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Can you all see my screen, please?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Cool. So, before I dropped off, I was saying that America is quite similar to the case we have in Europe because, it's a big continent with several countries as well. And even within the United States, they have several states also. And what America has developed, for its data landscape is what they call like a patchwork type of policy and regulation, because these regulations are more at the federal level and at the state level. And a typical example will be what I mentioned earlier on, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. That is one major one that they use, which is to protect from cyber threats and cyber attacks. And another common one is what they call the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or the HIPAA, if I might say that. Basically, the Health Insurance or the HIPAA Act, what it does is it's sort of like a data protection act, which is supposed to protect individual sensitive data. So whatever information you have about your health at the hospital shouldn't be given out at any point in time without your permission, and it should be protected as such. So it's a federal law, and it requires the creation of a national standard to protect sensitive patient health information from being disclosed. While these laws will offer some protection, they lack um, comprehensive approach of the GDPR. If you look at the autonomy that the GDPR gives individuals, is not the same with the United States, because now the United States is almost like they prioritize state's defense or state protection over individual protection. So there might be some cases where the state might override this law to get information about you if they feel you're a threat to the entire country. Whereas with the GDPR in Europe, it gives all the power to the person or the citizen to determine whether their information should be given out or it should be deleted. So there was a case in America, I think, with the law, with the government, where they were requiring, I think it was Apple, if I'm wrong, please correct me, that Apple or Facebook, and they needed information. Oh yes, I think I remember now. So during the 9/11 attack, they needed to bypass, it was with Apple actually, they needed to get information on some suspects or people who were involved in the whole attack. And per Apple's data protection, they are not allowed to give out this information without the consent of the user or their customer. And the state requested that information from them, and they insisted on not. But the state found a way to bypass, their Apple's security system to get that information to proceed with their, prosecutions of the suspected people. So here you have, that struggle with where, like I said, it's not as comprehensive as the GDPR, where the state feels like the state protection or the state defense is more important than the individual protection or rights protection or data right protection. So you have these things, sort of constantly clashing, where the state has to balance protecting its citizens' rights over protecting the state. So it's a big issue. And like I said, these are challenges that most countries or states will face. And initially, with laws like this, most laws are developed in countries where most of the laws, like I said, initially were developed to protect the state, most of the laws. And then, we started all moving into the internet world and digital world, and now concerns came and people had to, relook at the laws and also look at how they can protect people online, So you realize some of the laws are more skewed towards protecting national interest rather than individual interest, and this one of the challenges America faces constantly as well. And another way is, what they call the evidence-based um, debate, where the state surveillance programs, then you realize that, okay, how, first of all, is my data, which is your image when it comes to surveillance, state surveillance, your image is your data, basically. How is it being protected? Because now the government is doing surveillance without your consent. They are also tapping your phones to listen to your conversation, all in the name of, state or national security or state defense. And it's become, a really big issue in America for those who are advocating for digital rights protection and cyber laws. So there's an act that is in question now, which is called the Patriot Act, which basically is, what it means is that uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. So it doesn't matter whether you're a terrorist or not. Once the state thinks you're a terrorist, they will have to, override every other law to get your information just to confirm whether you're a terrorist or not. And if you're not, they've already violated your right, So it's quite delicate, So these laws are things that need to be looked at, and because there is an absence of a unified data protection law, it leaves gaps, also with consumer privacy rights as well. And currently, with the United States implementing their own regulations, it leads to inconsistencies and compliance burdens for businesses operating online, as well. So you have the likes of Facebook constantly dealing with the government, answering questions of data and here and there. I think recently there was also an issue with TikTok. The owner of TikTok had to come to America to face the Senate or the government and answer some questions as well in this regard. But they also believe that it's being used as a way to channel information to the Chinese government and all this stuff. But in the middle of all this, it's the users whose rights are being abused, basically. So we need to also look at that. So like I said, you need to look up these laws in your countries and then look at how they affect, your life and what it entails. So yes, in Canada, they have what they call the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Some of these laws are very long, even with when you read them out. In Canada, that's what they use, or the government use as privacy and data protection, but it also has gaps, and that might need addressing also. Like, say what they call the algorithmic discrimination and surveillance technology. And with this particular thing, honestly, in Africa, we can access some platforms in America, basically. And even if we can, there are limitations. For example, in Africa, you can access PayPal. And the only way you can access PayPal is when, I think when you're receiving, no, when you're sending money, but you can't receive money from PayPal. And, they come up with all these things. Like, yeah, is the financial system, is all these things. But it's a bit ridiculous because it also restricts businesses in Africa from also going global as well, because PayPal is everywhere. That means it restricts their access to certain markets as well. And these are all things that, cyber laws and data right policy are supposed to look at, and I think that's what they have here, where some people see certain content, others don't, and also they're also being monitored, especially with what Canada is facing with our algorithmic discrimination. So here with the areas of concern, lack of unified national data protection law, especially in the US, where each state has its own data protection law and cyber law and data rights policies, and also insufficient regulation of emerging technologies, with this case of Canada. Surveillance practices and the laws like the Patriot Act, like I mentioned earlier on, raises privacy issues. Cybersecurity standards they vary across sectors also, leading to uneven protection. So sometimes you might realize that if nobody takes time to read the terms and conditions on all these social media platforms, they are very different from one platform to the next. It's different on Facebook, different on Alibaba, is different on Twitter, is different on Instagram as well, different on LinkedIn. We don't have a unified law. So these are things people are not looking at, and they are happening. So you might be protected on one platform, on the other platform, you're not protected because the laws because of how their terms and conditions are designed, the law cannot tackle that. So you are obviously left, exposed on certain platforms than the others. Okay. So with this, the recommendations here, especially with North America or even America as a continent, would be to, have a comprehensive, advocate for a comprehensive and unified, data protection legislation board. And it's similar to what they have in the EU as well. And the same for Canada, for them to push privacy protection law as well. But some of these laws are a bit outdated also if you look at them carefully. Okay. Our next touch point. Okay, before I move on to the next one, which is Asia, are there any questions, comments, contributions? Anybody would like to share anything? Any experience they've had? Or any way they feel they've engaged online and they didn't feel protected? Okay. Okay, I see there's one question. Okay, no question. All right, so I'll proceed. So when it comes to Asia's approach to data rights and cybersecurity laws is very, very different, and it's the difference between the countries is so obvious. Sometimes it's absurd, and you realize that, for example, some nations like Singapore or some countries like Singapore, they have a robust regulation, such as what they call the Personal Data Protection Act and the Cybersecurity Act. And this act is supposed to promote data privacy and cybersecurity measures to protect its citizens from that. But if you look at countries like smaller countries like Vietnam and Taiwan and China, their data protection laws are completely different, and they are quite similar to what they have in the US, which is the state over individuals or the state over the citizens. So you might have countries that in the same region that lack comprehensive legislation and have vulnerability to the cyberspace as well. And in China, it's a common thing. In China, the Chinese citizens are constantly under surveillance, where every move and everything they do is being monitored, and no one is saying anything about that. Okay. So looking at the Asia region, is quite big. So it only makes sense that they are facing challenges with, a common data protection law, but also makes sense why they need one. They need to have one that is comprehensive and also homogeneous in a way, if you look at it. Okay. Even though Asia faces unique challenges, in Asia, is a common thing you can find is, state-sponsored cyber attacks, or what they call it, due to geopolitical tensions and cultural attitudes towards privacy and censorships. Mind you, most of these laws are designed also based on culture of the people in the country as well. So it plays a major role. I think that has also been a challenge because most cultures and contexts are a bit different in having, a unified law or cybersecurity act that protects the entire region. And you realize that some of the factors that complicate these efforts is to develop a nationwide or region-wide cooperation to have, a framework that applies to everybody. And this generally affects the entire cybersecurity of most countries as well. Okay. We've spoken about the Singapore PDPA and Cybersecurity Act. In China, we look at what, like I mentioned, China prioritizes the state control and censorship, and that raises a lot of issues when it comes to privacy and freedom of expression. In China, you just can't type anything and get away with it. Or you can't type, express yourself freely, or saying it because you're being monitored constantly. And their space or their digital space is quite restricted. I'm aware that with their WeChat, it's like a one-stop shop for their entire life. So they pay for things there, they chat there, they do all the credit score, all these things. They do them on their WeChat. And it's also easy for the government to also monitor because if everything's on one platform, they don't have to monitor several platforms. With one platform, they can monitor everybody in one space. So this is an issue because China has a huge, 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 huge gap when it comes to data right protection and cyber laws. India in this region also has a data protection bill, and basically what does it aims to regulate and process personal data, but it also faces criticisms with surveillance. I think surveillance is a common thing here with most big countries because the government always wants to be, on taps with what the citizens are up to. At the same time, violating their privacy as well. And it's becoming an issue, especially in the data space, on how to balance or have a fine balance between these. Okay. So, to wrap up or to finalize our session, we are going to look at Africa, which will be the last session, and we'll wrap up and have every other question addressed if any question comes up or any comment comes in. Okay. So what are the areas of concern? Like I said, you realize that most of these Asian countries, but especially China to be specific, there's lack of transparency and due process in their cyber laws. Their cyber laws are not explicit and they are not open to the public for you to read what's in there and what's not as well. So these are areas where non-profits can advocate for. And then also surveillance concerns as well with potential government, or with constantly monitoring its citizens online, in the case of India and China. And the recommendation here is, to have, support efforts to strengthen privacy and privacy protection and transparency when it comes to cyber laws in these areas also. Okay. I've spoken about all these other countries that seem to be far ahead in terms of cyber laws and digital rights. But when we come to Africa, Africa has made huge strides, huge, huge strides, huge strides. I might pick some countries like Ghana, Nigeria, or Senegal. They've made a lot of progress when it comes to cyber laws and cyber security and data rights. Africa has seen significant progress in the data rights and cyber law legislation in recent years, with countries like South Africa that has laws such as the Protection of Information Act, the African Union that also has developed its own convention on cybersecurity and personal data protection, we've come a long way, in addressing issues of digital rights. But one of the outstanding issue is having a law that cuts across the entire region seamlessly, and that can be applied in each region, or that can be adopted per each region. That is where Africa lacks the most. Okay, so when we look at South Africa with their what they call POPIA Regulation Act, basically, it's quite similar to the GDPR. It regulates the processing of personal data or personal information and aligns it with international protection and data protection standards as well. So it draws more from that angle. So it's more human-centered act as opposed to state-oriented act. You have Kenya with their Data Protection Act, which enhances data privacy rights, but also faces challenges with implementation and enforcement. Africa. However, implementation and enforcement remain huge challenge. In spite of all this progress that we made on the continent, huge challenges. And the key here is also because of the rapid development of the digital space as well. It's quite difficult for governments to keep up, to constantly set rules and regulations or cyber laws to address issues with digital space, because it's evolving at a very fast rate. Resources are not available, and then the expertise as well to be able to look at them and then quickly address these things. So because of this issue, there are huge gaps in there, especially even with implementation and resource constraints. And also, like I mentioned, there's a limit to having one that is encompassing for most countries as well. What are the recommendations for this one? So the recommendations for the few laws that we looked at in Africa is, first of all, capacity initiatives to build a capacity of organizations that are working in this area, or non-profit that are working in the area of digital rights, and also institutions that are supposed to implement or enforce these digital rights laws as well. There needs to be some capacity building for them to be able to be effective and efficient. The next one will be to advocate for a regional cooperation and harmonization of data protection regulation in Africa. So you have one regulation that applies to all 50, is it 54, 53 countries on the continent. Okay, so we have a question. The question, Debbie is asking, what are the recommendations for nonprofits with their websites to respect to privacy laws? Okay, perfect. So for nonprofit, it is every nonprofit that has a website needs a data protection policy, and it has to be on a website. So whoever visits your website should be able to read and understand that. Every organization or nonprofit that has a website needs a data protection policy for them. It also gives people who visit these websites some sense of confidence that their data is safe as well. And also that for your partners and constituents, it builds their confidence that you are managing their data appropriately, and they are not going to be leaked to some company to come in and do advertisement for them. So it is very important that every nonprofit should have and design a data protection policy as well, and share with their participants and constituents to also be aware of how they manage their data when they share them with them. Because, for example, meetings like this, you need to register, you provide information. What happens to the information after? How is the organization using the information? All these are things that need to be put in place. So for nonprofits, it is imperative to have a data policy in your organization that covers data protection from your website even to the office space as well. Yes. So I hope, David, this answers your question.
It did, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So with that question, I'll bring our session today to an end. And I hope that our brief analysis has given some insight into exactly the digital terrain and how to navigate your way there once you are, online as well. If there are any questions, any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call you and you can respond to it.
Thank you, Fiifi.
Thank you.
It does not look like anyone else had asked any questions, but I appreciate you hosting this session and also can't wait for next week. Not next week, excuse me, next month.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity as well.
Awesome.
Really
Right.
appreciate it.
All right.
Yes. So I think that'll be all. I'll share the document with you in case the participant will need it also to do a step down training. That will be fine.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you
Awesome.
very much.
Thank you.